It is a couple minutes after 6, so we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll let people in as they file in. My name is Amanda Rose. I am the preservation planner for the city of Franklin, and I appreciate all of you coming today to learn more about the design guidelines update that we're working toward. I'm having some issues seeing everybody, so forgive me if the Zoom bar kind of goes back and forth on the screen. We are excited to share this information with you today. I want to tell you more about the Historic District Design Guidelines and what they do and what we're looking to do to update them. So to start, the design guidelines are the policy document that the Historic Zoning Commission uses to help consider any alterations to exteriors of properties for approval within the historic preservation overlay. The overlay is consistent of a number of our historic districts. You primarily would see those downtown and those residential areas right outside of the core of downtown. That document is a best case scenario document for the treatment of and preservation of historic materials and historic structures and how to make changes to those that are appropriate in light of the federal standards and the state standards and the local standards that we apply. The document also touches on alterations in the form of new construction, demolition, additions to buildings, and how those can be compatible with the existing historic fabric. There are also considerations that are made with that document in terms of design policies and goals for the overall historic district area. The commission uses that to make those decisions, but that document is put together by the community with staff's help, and it is approved by the Historic Zoning Commission for a recommendation, ideally, and then it goes to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen for consideration of approval. So it is a document that is endorsed by the city government and the mayor himself. And the intent is to, again, preserve and maintain historic structures, materials, and to have compatibility with those materials through the introduction of new ones. So as we move forward, I did want to let you know that we welcome any questions. We will have the chat feature disabled during the time of my presentation, just so there's no pop-ups and any distractions there, but feel free to send those questions as the presentation concludes. Victoria Hensley, a planner with the planning department, will overview all those with me, and I'll answer those questions as best as I can. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started. So just a quick background on how we got to this point. The Historic Zoning Commission, through its design review committee, has been working with staff pretty diligently for the last several months. We've had 5 public meetings, including a kickoff meeting, in order to entertain discussion on what needs we have for our revised document. A public survey was also published. We had a very good turnout of responses on that. And that public survey was used to provide information to staff and to the commission on how well the document currently works, what the issues are with the document, what issues are important to the community to consider when revising the document. And then, as you see, we released a draft of the public document in October. We've been really excited to have some feedback so far on how that document appears to everybody, how well it seems to address those issues at hand. And I'll go ahead and go over some of those issues that we've identified, our goals and objectives in working toward this. Before that, the intended schedule that you see on the screen is that we will continue to meet. We're meeting today, of course, as you can see. We'll continue to offer open office hours. So if you have questions about specific projects, we're more than happy to meet with you. Myself and a couple of other planners in our department will be available all day from 8 to 5 p.m. tomorrow and on Friday. So 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. both of those days. Feel free to come by City Hall. We will be available to answer any of your specific or general questions about the update to the document. And you are free to walk in. We'll be in the training room. That is the big room at the end of the building that is closest to or furthest away from the square. So next steps for the document will be that we are hosting a special design review committee meeting on February 7th. At that time, I will overview the comments that I received here today, comments I've previously received from the public, as well as comments from individual commissioners as I've been meeting with them individually to go over their questions, concerns, comments related to the document. So I'll analyze that and present that on the 7th. We are looking to release the final draft on March 4th. It's very exciting. So everything that we're doing between now and then is to brush up this first draft, get it ready for final, and then we will review the final draft with the Design Review Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Historic Zoning Commission on March the 12th. That is a public meeting. You're welcome to come to attend that, or you can watch it virtually. We also have the approval schedule ready. We would like to take this to the Historic Zoning Commission for a formal recommendation to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen in April on its April 11th meeting. Then move that forward to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen for a work session discussion on May 10th, and then seeking formal approval on May 24th. So that'll time out well with National Preservation Month. We're very excited about that. And we're very hopeful for this schedule. We'll keep you updated if there are any changes to that. So a summary of the key changes for the document is that we've addressed the goals outlined here. The number one goal is the framework. The document as it currently exists was a little bit more difficult to navigate than we would like. We've been spoiled by our new framework for the Franklin zoning ordinance and wanted to follow suit to have something a little bit more easy to use. So the framework's been adjusted. I'll go over that. We have provided some improvements to graphics. Ease of use would be the graphics. It would also be the framework, but also too, adopting a flipping book concept, which we have for our zoning ordinance. So those of you who have used that will know what I mean. It's very, very intuitive and it's fun to use. We've also made some updates to be reflective of the most recent updated zoning ordinance for cohesiveness between our policy documents. And we've also addressed some specific design guidelines that have been problematic and or just a little tweaking needed to make them more user-friendly. So with the framework, this is the general framework of our document. You can see that it's divided into headings that are a little bit more intuitive than they have been in the past. We have the introductory material, which would include how to use the document, what the document's purpose is, and general information about policies in Franklin as related to overall approval process for building permitting, etc. We also have residential buildings, commercial buildings. We've created a new section called civic buildings that will address churches most likely, but also other buildings that are not residential or commercial, because civic buildings have appurtenances like towers and different types of windows, things that will be different than a house or a commercial building. So we felt that it would be nice to add those in to provide a little bit difference of consideration for those. We also have major considerations like accessory structures. That would be your garages, your outbuildings, site and setting that is more like parking and landscaping to the degree of where your parking pads are, where your driveways go, etc. Extensive grading considerations or not, retaining walls and fences. We also have signs, which we review pretty regularly. Modern features like rooftop features or terraces or things that would not have been typical to the buildings when they were built. More like utilities, HVAC functions, etc. Demolition, relocation, and then we also have a pretty extensive section on where our resources are and why they're important and what those typical characteristics are and design goals are for those areas. we're very, very excited about the new framework. So just to give you a visual of the new framework, you can see this is a clip of the Chapter 3 commercial buildings. You can see that it is divided out into 4 sections. If you are seeking to alter an existing historic building, you would use this section. If you'd like to add to that building, this section. If you have a historic district designation, but you're actually not a historic building. For example, City Hall is not a historic building. The building next to City Hall is not a historic building. So if there's any sort of alterations to those, they would fall into this category. And then if you're building a new building altogether, that would fall into this category. So it's a lot more intuitive on finding that information. Here's another example for signage. Signs are part of this department's review pretty regularly. So this is divided for the forms of the buildings. Again, it's not the use, it's the form. We have buildings that were built as residential forms that would follow these standards, as well as residential buildings. There are a lot of residential forms in downtown Franklin in particular that have uses that are not residential. So they can have signage, but that signage needs to be considered differently because the form is different than a commercial building. So all that's listed here. We also have improved graphics. This is an example for signage. You can see I don't have the clip that shows what the numbers mean specifically, but I did want to give you an overview of how we are relating what these sign types are and how they may look, so that it's a little bit easier for an applicant to understand the types of signage that would apply to them and what those parameters are for approval. So this is also another graphic that helps to demonstrate a guideline. This is more related to a residential form, but you can see that it shows that any addition to a residential form should be limited to no more than 50% of the historic footprint. It also shows that this is the historic footprint, what 50% of that would be. And then it notes that any portions of a building approved for demolition by the commission are not counted toward that. So what often happens at a commission meeting, if someone's seeking approval for an addition, for example, they'll ask to remove part of the building in the back, maybe a porch, in order to accommodate an addition. So it's just more clarification on how you make those calculations. I do believe that this will be very helpful. I've already received some great feedback from some design professionals that have indicated that, and I'm very happy to hear it. I look forward to hearing what you think about that as well. Here's another example of a graphic. You see we have a graphic that shows the appropriate placement for fencing, for example. Fencing is a little bit difficult at times, so we really wanted to help relay through a graphic. You can see the yellow shows that you would apply front yard standards, and the blue would show that you apply rear yard standards. So we're trying to show very distinctly where those standards apply. A standard should be different for front yard, whether it's height, opacity, than it would be for rear yard, where you would expect a lot more privacy. Okay, so some of the general principles that we've introduced in the formatter would be that we're providing some graphics to illustrate appropriate locations of facade alterations. It's a common question we receive. It's like, where is it most appropriate to make changes to my home or to my business? And how would I go about making decisions to prioritize where those changes are? So we have provided some graphics, and I'll show you that here in a moment. We've also proposed to extend administrative review authority slightly. Right now, authority for administrative review is limited to signs, fences that are in rear yards, HVAC screening and placement, and then also awnings and awnings related to signage. We would like to extend that authority to expand to include minor alterations to non-historic components of buildings that are at rear or obscured elevations. So if there's minor changes at the rear of buildings, non-historic windows at the rear of a building that an applicant would like to replace, for example, then that would be something that could be vetted administratively through a brief application process. It would not necessarily need to go through a monthly commission process. We've also provided more information about how the guidelines framework works and how you would apply it to your project. So as I noted, this is a screenshot of the flipping book. You can see that you have the table of contents on the side. It's very similar to what you see with the zoning ordinance if you viewed that. This is the graphic information I mentioned about locating facade alterations. And there's additional information as you go through this introduction on the approval process and how it works. I'm very excited that when you click on these individual table of contents headings, you would be directed specifically to that page. So it is clickable. It is very easy to use in that respect. So moving on to amendments we're proposing to the specific guidelines in the document. For residential, as related to new construction and additions, we are proposing to provide more specific guidance on where those alterations should take place, the form of those. Dormers particularly, we've had a lot of questions and questions about how to size, place dormers that would be appropriate for either a house or a garage or an addition. So we provided more information on that. We've also provided more information on how to address scale as related to a house in an addition to a house or a house in a new garage. So it is important in our zoning ordinance, in our recommendations for the design guidelines, that any additions be sensitive to the scale of the house and not have a higher scale than the house. Also, that same thought for a garage versus a house that it serves. We're also providing more specific guidance on where side elevations should go. Side elevations are not recommended, and they're not recommended in most communities. But what we have outlined here to give more guidance to our citizens is that additions should be placed at rear locations with limited visibility from the street. And if a rear addition is not feasible, it should go in a certain place that would not overwhelm the original structure, that it would not require removal of character defining historic features to allow for its placement, and that it's set back from the form, and that it is of a subservient width to the form, specifically no more than a third of the width of the house. We've also provided more graphics to illustrate the appropriate and inappropriate placement of these considerations. So you'll find those throughout the document, mainly at the front section of each of those chapters. This is a graphic that demonstrates dormers, for example. So you can see there are numbers that correspond to different portions on the illustrative graphic that give an applicant more of an understanding of the appropriate placement of a dormer as related to the overall roof and to other dormers on the building. Moving along, we have guidelines to better address additions on larger lots. Specifically, staff is recommending at this time that the Historic Zoning Commission may consider a larger addition than 50% if a lot is larger with deeper setbacks, with minimal visibility offered from street views, and where all other applicable guidelines are met. This is still under discussion, of course, and we've had a lot of comment from the public and from the individual commissioners on this. So we'll certainly be looking at all of that and analysis take place and ensure that we address that proposed guideline to be something that everyone feels comfortable with. We've also provided more information on how infill buildings on newly created streets can be addressed. That is something that we've had every now and then in a historic district as a new neighborhood pops up, and we want to ensure compatibility with the existing established historic fabric. So we are looking to address how an applicant relates things like height, scale, and massing to the existing historic fabric, and would be able to be compatible with those. And alterations to the form would be minimal, but you could have more flexibility on different detailing considerations in order to be differentiated, so it doesn't appear to be mimicking a historic form entirely, but it would be congruent with the overall neighborhood, settle nicely. The main guideline that we are addressing is a proposal to remove maximum building coverage. Currently, it is recommended in residential areas in the historic district that there's no more than 35% roof coverage. So that coverage would be anything under roof, be your enclosed spaces, your porches. That is a consideration we've had for several years now to help maintain context up and down the street. What we found is that the landscape surface area requirements of the zoning ordinance tend to help with that consideration. So landscape surface area, in very general terms, is the consideration of all your impervious materials on a property. That would be your driveways, your walkways, your pools, your covered areas like porches and enclosed spaces. That number is regulated by the zoning ordinance per district in order to ensure considerations like stormwater and ensure that we are not covering too much of our land with places where water cannot drain generally. But that number is typically 40% in the historic areas. That's not for every district, but most of our district in the historic areas is 40%. So that 35 to 40% difference is negligible. It is something that I've had a lot of comments on. We may address this in a different way based on the comments that we've received from you and others. But right now that is the recommendation from staff. As for alterations to the commercial guidelines, we are recommending against the placement of rooftop patios, terraces, or decks onto the roofs of historic buildings. That seems to be the consensus that we've heard from numerous folks in our community over the last few years as those have been broached. The massing and scale of new commercial buildings should be consistent with historic buildings on that block face, and that new buildings should be placed in accordance with the historic precedent established on that block face. So as redevelopment occurs in areas where it's deemed appropriate, that it takes massing cues and spacing cues from the buildings that are right there around it, or if not established on that block face, on the opposite block face. For signage, we have developed helpful classifications that are consistent with our zoning ordinance. It provides guidance for new neighborhoods, like I mentioned, new residential infill neighborhoods. It provides information on lighting for signage, and it provides guidance and additional flexibility for some of our Main Street and Number Street areas where we have a tenant on the bottom floor, and then there's a door for a walk-up stair that goes to another business above, so that we're able to be practical and equitable in the placement and the numbering of signage up and down the street while meeting the overall intent for lack of clutter and visual continuity. So here's another example for signage. I had mentioned earlier that residential forms require a little bit more consideration for nuanced signage. And so this gives a potential applicant understanding of what types of signs are available and where their placement may be appropriate. As for accessory structures, we have more guidance on how to treat historic structures that are accessory versus non-historic ones. And we also have guidance for placement of dormers, as I mentioned before, placement of these structures overall in relation to the rest of the site, the scale, the congruency in relation to the house it serves, and more guidance on sizing. We've had a lot of questions on sizing. The zoning ordinance more or less limits accessory structures in the areas in the historic districts to no more than 1.5 stories. So what a half story is has been something that we have tried to provide guidance to our citizens, our design professionals on. So this proposes that a half story be no more than 60% of the footprint below. So that gives some measure of continuity up and down the street that gives a more intricate presence for the accessory structure versus the house that it serves. And it gives the applicants what they've been asking for, more of a number by which to consider those things. We also have more information to designate historic versus non-historic and how to treat those non-historic structures. Excuse me. So non-historic structures in a historic district are a reality. We have more historic than non, of course, but treatment of non-historic is important in order to ensure compatibility with those main overall forms of a district, but also needs to be considered more lightly because it doesn't have historic materials or historic integrity. So we do have more information on how to treat additions to buildings that are non-historic. And we also eliminated through this proposal, a percentage of how the addition should relate to the existing structure. That is one that we've had a lot of questions on. I do think we may need to amend this at some point to either eliminate it or to give a number specifically. We find that a lot of folks like to have a number by which to consider additions rather than a more theoretical approach as subservient versus non. We have provided lots of guidance on building lighting. That has been a question that we've had often and an ask from our community. So we've definitely included that. Modern features will address how to treat rooftop features, skylights, and security bars on buildings that are non-historic. And then we've also enhanced our glossary quite a bit to include more commonly used words that you'll hear us say at DRC meetings, historic zoning meetings, and tried to be really thoughtful on removing lots of jargon so that it's more accessible to the public. So our next steps, as we're moving forward with this process, as I mentioned, we want to hear your feedback. We're very excited about getting it. We have collected our public survey information. We are collecting information from you actively right now, and we are intending to finish up interviews with individual historic zoning commissioners. We'd like to collect and analyze that information and amend the first draft accordingly so that we can release a final draft on March the 4th. The Design Review Committee of the Historic Zoning Commission will be meeting to hold a special meeting on Monday, February 7th, in order to hear from staff an overview of the final draft. You are more than welcome to attend that or to watch it live on Franklin TV or Facebook. We are also looking to seek that first formal recommendation from the Historic Zoning Commission on this document at its April 11th meeting. So this is all coming pretty soon. We are very excited about it. And that'll conclude my presentation. So I am opening up to any questions you may have. Victoria, have we received any questions, or you guys feel free to type your questions in now and we'll address those as we get those.
The chat function should be open and available now.
Thanks, Victoria. While we're waiting to get those questions in, I do want to thank you again for joining us this evening. And I'm excited for the folks who came in late to let you know that we are offering open office hours tomorrow from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and also on Friday from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. to allow folks to come to City Hall in the training room to ask any questions or to offer any sort of feedback you have, either specific to a project in mind or in general. We'll have 3 or 4 planners there. They'll be more than happy to help you.
Amanda, we have our first question. There is a question about whether or not people can see what specifically has been changed. As in, is there a track changes function or maybe even like a comparison guide or anything like that?
Well, that's a great question. I am not prepared to have that for you today, but that is something we can look at. We've changed the document so thoroughly that the whole entire framework is different. So it's very difficult to mark it up in very specific terms. If we were to do that, it will probably be 95% of it that would be changed. What I covered today was the very major key elements of the proposed changes, whether it's the framework itself or the individual guidelines. What I can do working forward is put together a list of the alterations that are proposed to the individual guidelines, because I think that might be what the question is getting at. Alan, is that what you'd like to see more specifically? Okay, great. So I can work on that. The document is so different, as you all know, and different, and hopefully what you find to be a good way. But I can work on providing that information as best as possible. And when we get that, I will work with my supervisor to determine the best way to disseminate that to you all. Are there any other questions?
Okay, we've got a couple coming in. One is regarding a clarification by infill buildings should not mimic historic buildings.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. So in a basic historic preservation planning theory, we'd like to see that historic buildings be the quote unquote stars of our downtown area, our neighborhoods that we've identified as being worthy of being in a historic district, and that everything that's new lands softly. So we would like for the update to reflect that new buildings should have similar height, massing, scale, setbacks as historic buildings, but also be recognizable as new buildings. We would not want someone to visit our community, for example, and think that every building in downtown is historic. Most of them are, but we have some new buildings. Like, I'll just, for sake of ensuring that everyone knows which building I'm talking about, I'll say the 231 Public Square building. That is the building right on Public Square next to City Hall. We've received a lot of good feedback on that. That is an entirely new building, and it's not historic, and everyone can tell that it's not historic, but we've received a lot of feedback about how it lands softly. It's something that is identifiably new, but it doesn't detract so much from the historic buildings around it, which is the intent of my comment. I hope that helps answer your question, Bob. Any other questions?
Alderman Berger, could you possibly clarify your question in the comment box for us, please?
I believe that Alderman Berger may be asking about the recommendation against having rooftops and terraces on historic buildings. Okay, so I am happy to address that. We have had a lot of feedback from the community about where to appropriately place those building elements. It appears from the feedback we've received from the public that the public would not like to see those features very visibly on historic buildings. So it is recommended currently that those features not be on historic buildings, but rather on newer buildings. When a historic building introduces rooftop features, it more often than not requires that there be a new level created, whether it's not a full footprint of the existing building, but some sort of a rooftop landing area for a stairwell that can be very, very distracting and eye-catching. So adding that element is not advised by the guidelines because it would be highly visible, because you have to have some sort of way for folks to get up there. We haven't been able to determine a way that people can end up on rooftops without having a whole stairwell element added. That's, you know, a good 6-7 feet of pedestrian landing space for the stair to land and someone walk out. So Victoria, it sounds like there might be another comment.
Yes, that looks like another comment. Regarding just this particular change being limiting and potentially having a look at some examples in places like Savannah and Charleston.
Okay, well, we definitely appreciate that comment. We'll mark that and look at ways where we can possibly introduce those elements in a way that would not add additional floors to a building. Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? We'll wait a second to see if any of those come in. In the meantime, I do want to share that we are recording this and that we will share this to put on YouTube for anyone to be able to access in the future. If you haven't visited YouTube, you can search for City of Franklin, Tennessee YouTube, and you can find our page there. It's divided by playlist. You can find any meeting you're looking for divided by playlist. It's very accessible. We'll have this here on YouTube so that you can reference it later. And we'll certainly go back and reference this and record your comments. Feel free to share the link for YouTube with anyone if they weren't able to join us tonight, as we would like to hear everybody's comments. Feel free to share those with us at design guidelines at franklintn.gov. Again, that's design guidelines at franklintn.gov. And I am hopeful to hear from you here in the next couple of weeks as we collect and analyze and hopefully bring something forward for March 4th. Victoria, any other questions or comments?
Mr. Sims, thank you for attending. Ms. Bergen, thank you as well. Thank you all. We're just getting lots of thanks now. So let us give our appreciation back to you all for attending.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very, very much. All right, we'll conclude if there's no more questions. Again, I'm Amanda Rose. You can reach me directly during open office hours tomorrow and Friday at City Hall in the training room, or you can email us at designguidelines@franklintn.gov. Again, thank you so much. We appreciate you on behalf of the Department of Planning and Sustainability in the City of Franklin. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks.